right, so today I'm going to be talking about illusory consensus effects, and some of this work is done with Ronick. Some of this work was done with a graduate student and my graduate advisor, Norbert Schwarz. And then I'm going to be, for the discussion, Ronick and I are thinking through future directions, and we've got a couple starts, so anytime we have for feedback on that and thoughts on that would be appreciated. So to start, so perceptions of consensus, what others people know and believe, play a key role in our own attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. But we rarely have access to the actual number of how many people know or believe something. And instead, we draw on other cues, such as how often we've heard something before and feelings of familiarity. And so instead of having like, oh, 40% of people know this or 50% of people know this, you just have to make an estimate based on your own experiences. And in making those estimates, we may rely more on how familiar something feels than the source of that familiarity. And so I'll give you some examples. There's some work looking at how people make estimates of opinions. And what this work finds is that if you have one person repeating something 3 times or 3 different people repeating something 1 time, presumably having 3 people repeat something 1 time is a good cue that more people believe something, while one person repeating one thing multiple times doesn't have that same cue, but this work finds that one person repeating something repeatedly or repeating an opinion increases perceptions of how many other people share that opinion. So if I share my opinion about this talk and I share it 3 times, that might make you think that more other people also share this opinion. There's also work that Ronick's done looking at belief in news headlines. And in this work, he presents people with headlines either from one user sharing the same headline multiple times or from 3 different users sharing, each sharing the headline once, and asked people about how many people would believe those true and false headlines, and finds that the effects of repetition are the same, both when you see that headline coming from the same user repeatedly and when you see it coming from different users. And so in these cases, people are being influenced oftentimes more by just how many times they see something and are less attentive to the source of that information. And there's some other work that also speaks to this. However, the mere repetition of information, the mere repetition of information had not yet been tested in isolation from other source and contextual cues. So basically, I'd been trying to write papers and wanted to just say that merely repeating something increases estimates of its consensus. And I couldn't find any work that had done this. And I was like, someone must have done this. And like many years passed and me wanting to cite this and I couldn't find it. And so I was like, this is time to test this. Does just merely repeating information, even if it doesn't come with any other source cues, increase perceptions of how broadly known or believed it is? And so Ronick and I got together and tested this question, whether mere repetition increases estimates of consensus. Many of you are probably familiar with the illusory truth effect, which is a similar kind of idea where just repeating information increases perceptions of how true it is. And so we were thinking about doing something similar, but with consensus. And we hypothesized that there would be 2 pathways through which this effect might occur. First, repetition increases processing ease, which can then be used as a heuristic cue to infer consensus. And so if something feels easy to process, I must have encountered it many times before. If I've encountered it many times before, I might have heard it from lots of people. And so in that sense, just that mere familiarity can be a good cue that something is broadly believed or known. We also suspected another potential pathway that we saw for this was that repetition increases one's own belief and perceptions of prior knowledge. And then individuals draw on their own beliefs and knowledge to make judgments about others' beliefs and knowledge. So if it's repeated and I believe it more, then I also think that other people believe it more because I'm using my own beliefs as a cue for what others believe. And so we think that these two pathways are likely highly interconnected, and we didn't try to tease them apart, but they would both lead to the same prediction of repetition, increasing perceptions of consensus. So our general methods, we use prolific workers, and I'm going to present just the first two studies here. I have the third study at the end of the presentation if there's time, but I'll be talking about the first two. In an exposure phase, participants viewed a series of trivia claims. I'll give you an example of these in a minute. And then we had a short delay, and then a judgment phase where participants made consensus estimates about the claims, half of which they had seen previously during exposure and half of which were new. In experiment 1, our DV was, we looked at perceptions of belief. And so here are the more specific stimuli. We used here 72 trivia claims, half true, half false. An example of a true claim is that fly fishing is the oldest method of recreational fishing. An example of a false claim is that mayonnaise is usually made with raw egg whites. It's made with egg yolks. And then our DV was, how many Americans do you think would believe this claim? On a scale from hardly anyone to almost everyone, 1 to 10. And our results, this was a straightforward t-test here that we did, and we found a significant illusory consensus effect, which is what we're calling it, such that repeated claims were people judged that more others would believe repeated claims with a mean of 6.65 than new claims 6.17. In our second study, we wanted to look at a different measure of consensus, and so we looked at perceptions of current knowledge, so how many people know this information. Here we used all true trivia claims because it would be strange to ask people how many others know this false claim. So how many other people know the world is flat? That wouldn't make sense to answer. So we used all true claims here, but they looked similar to the claims in experiment 1. And here we asked how many Americans know this information, again, from hardly anyone to almost everyone. And our results here are also quite straightforward, where we found a significant illusory consensus effect, such that people estimated that more others would know repeated claims with a mean of 4.39, compared to new claims with a mean of 4.09. And both of these were medium to large effect sizes. So here Cohen's d of 0.66. So quite straightforward. We found strong evidence for an illusory consensus effect such that the mere repetition of information increases perceptions of its consensus. And so we've since then been thinking about extensions of this work, and one line of studies that is currently in prep and close to being submitted is work looking at the effects of repetition on perceptions of scientific consensus. And so we're particularly influenced by our perceptions of what experts believe, or the people that we view as experts, and exposures to messages about expert consensus can increase belief in a variety of scientific facts, can increase engagement in desirable behaviors, and so it can be a really effective intervention. But less is known about how people make these estimates in the absence of explicit information. And so here what we wanted to ask was, does repetition also increase estimates of a scientific consensus? And does this effect occur even when exposure doesn't come with source information, so when it's just mere repetition? And does it also occur when the information is attributed to a non-expert source at exposure? The methods looked quite similar here. We used prolific workers. Their participants viewed a series of 18 health-related claims at exposure, half true, half false. And so, for example, scabies are often spread in public swimming pools. That's false. Ticks cause paralysis. That's true. And disposable chopsticks contain carcinogens. That's false. And so there was, like before, a judgment phase where participants, and then like before, there was a judgment phase where participants judged scientific consensus in 36 claims, 18 which they'd seen at exposure, and 18 which were new. And here for the DV, the statement that people were judging was there is clear consensus in the scientific community that, and then we would insert the claim. And the scale was strongly disagree to strongly agree. In experiment 1, claims weren't attributed to any source at exposure. And so the results here, to orient you, higher means greater estimates of that there's greater agreement that there's scientific consensus, and the red is new claims and the blue are repeated claims. And we found here that people judge the repeated claims to have greater scientific consensus compared to the new claims. So evidence of consensus effect here as well. And it's a medium-sized effect of 0.48. We then ran a second experiment where we wanted to attribute claims to either an expert or non-expert source at exposure. And then in experiment 3, we replicated experiment 2 and added a longer 3 to 5 day delay. And this delay was manipulated between subjects. So for some people, we had them do the consensus estimate after just a few minutes. And then for some participants, they came back 3 to 5 days later and made those estimates. Okay. And here's our source manipulation to manipulate source expertise. During the exposure phase, participants were told that the claims they would view were either from a Facebook group. Let's see, I actually have, sorry, I think, yes, I'm just showing you these. So for participants, either were told that the claims were coming from the source on the left, which was the Massachusetts Journal of Medicine, that they came from this Facebook discussion, which is open only to verified healthcare professionals and medical researchers, and that we were showed them statements coming from a recent post in which they shared their favorite health information they learned in the past year. Or participants were told that the statements they were seeing were coming from this parents supporting parents group, and it was noted that these discussions should not be taken as professional or expert advice. And so this is how we manipulated the source expertise here. And for results, okay, here's experiment 1. Here is when participants got the non-expert source, so the parent group. And so I want to note here that these error bars are not corrected for being repeated measures. So it's not that the overlap doesn't indicate significance necessarily. But I'll show you the means here. So here's non-expert source, expert source. For the stats, there was a significant interaction of source and repetition. So people, such that seeing the claims repeated from an expert source increased perceptions of consensus more than from the non-expert source. And looking at the non-expert source, there was a marginally significant effective repetition, P of 0.07, and from an expert source, there was a significant effect. So here we found that seeing information from an expert source increased perceptions of consensus significantly. It didn't reach significance from the non-expert source, but we were not well powered for an effect size as small as D of 0.31. We then replicated this in experiment 3 with both an immediate condition and a delay condition. The no delay condition looked exactly like experiment 2, so it was a replication. And so our results also looked the same as experiment 2. And then after a delay, we also found a similar pattern. And then here's some stats. Basically, the effective repetition was always larger when exposure came from an expert source. And we had 2 conditions in which the effects were only marginally significant, and those were these 2 immediate conditions. It was significant across all the other conditions. And so what we did was we did then a mega analysis across those 2 conditions because neither of them were powered enough to show an effect size as small as what we were seeing alone. And here, when we combine across them, we found the size of the effect from the expert source across those 2 conditions, Cohen's d of 0.7. From the non-expert source, now this was significant, Cohen's d of 0.36. And for comparison, with no source, it was in between of 0.48. So that was just like me trying to fit in a lot of numbers there. But essentially, the takeaway of the results is that we found that repeating true and false health claims increased perceptions that they have scientific consensus. This occurred when repetition didn't come with the source. It occurs when it came from a non-expert source, although the effect size was a bit smaller. And it also occurs when it came from an expert source. And we observed it with a short delay and a longer delay. And the effect was larger for exposure from an expert versus non-expert source. Okay, so now I've ran through, let's see. Yeah, I'll do the implications. Yes. So the implications here, a single exposure to a false claim may be sufficient to increase perceptions, both of its general consensus and of scientific consensus, at least for health-related claims. People can be sensitive to the relevance of the source of exposure. However, even seeing information from a non-expert source can influence perceptions of expert consensus. And for you all, as people who think about our social media environments, there's important implications here for how the affordances of our social media environments and the type of content which we see influences our perceptions of consensus. And so I have some questions here that point to the future directions that Ronik and I have been thinking about and have done some initial studies trying to start to get after. And these are questions that are the things that we would like to discuss, or if you have input on or interest in, that we would love to hear from you on. But one question is, what are the effects of extreme content being overrepresented in media environments? And so this paper from Claire and your crew is highly relevant here, where people are often disproportionately exposed to more extreme attitudes and beliefs than are represented in the actual distribution of beliefs in the general population. And so what role does that exposure play in perceived polarization specifically? And so the next question then is, how does this repetition increase, or how does this effect of repetition on consensus play out in a polarized information environment? And so what happens when you see content that's in-group favorable, repeated disproportionately, or out-group favorable information that's more extreme, repeated disproportionately? How does repetition affect your judgments of what your in-group believes compared to your judgments of what the out-group believes? Does repetition influence one more than the other? Does it depend on what content you're viewing? And then we've also been teasing apart and trying to figure out, how do the effects of repetition on consensus differ from the effects of repetition on truth? So what situations might there be where repetition changes your consensus estimates, but it doesn't change what you believe? Are there situations where repetition changes what you believe, but doesn't change your perceptions of what others believe? And how are those two interconnected? And so we have an initial study on both of these lines, on the polarized content and on repetition and consensus versus truth. And I have some slides on those, but I just thought I would see where then the discussion goes and what people's reactions are to that, because I think that there's a lot of different directions to go here, and we're trying to figure out what makes the most sense to do next with this. But before that, would like to thank the collaborators on this work, and also note the NSF support before they canceled it or terminated it. So thank you.
They really consider your postdoc?
Oh yeah, I was an NSF postdoc. That's why I'm now a temporary research scientist. Luckily, I was able to withdraw a bunch of funds before mine was terminated. And so when they terminated it, they left me with like 8 months of funding. And so I've been using that to still cover a good part. And then I was lucky that the center I'm at was able to create like a part-time research scientist role to fill the difference. But yeah, I was one of the terminations.
So sorry. Great talk, though.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts?
This is great, thanks. I'm sorry, I walked in a little late. I had some bike trouble, so I might have missed this. But So I know the information was presented from like the non-experts. But did you ever have a condition where it was explicitly like labeled as false or with any sort of like correction? And okay.
No, keep going.
Sorry. So I know you're interested in the effect of like perceived consensus, but I wonder if like if you see like when Twitter used to have like the community fact check or something, like would that impact people's perceptions or something like that, like have an explicit label of this might not be true? Have you thought about that or are you interested in that?
Yeah, so in these studies, we weren't necessarily interested in true versus false information, and we did this thing that that is typically done in this work where we normed the true and false claims to both be ambiguous in terms of truth, and so it's difficult for people to tell if they're true or false. And so we weren't then really trying to tease apart the true versus false and corrections. In terms of this repetition paradigm, are you thinking of like that the correction would come at exposure? So you're seeing a claim and then you're seeing the claim with the correction as the exposure, um, is my guess, and then you're coming back later and judging the claim. This is yeah, and so that would it's interesting because the community notes then is another consensus queue. And I think that there's a lot of interesting dynamics online in terms of the consensus queues that you're getting. And so you're getting like the likes on it, you're getting the comments, you're getting whether people are agreeing in the comments or not agreeing in the comments, you're getting the sharing metrics. And so I do think that all of those things are also important inputs to consensus estimates. And so considering the way in which information is repeated and the consensus cues that are coming with them at those different time points would be a really important extension. It's not something that we've really thought about yet with our work. We wanted to establish this base effect first and then build on it. But I think future directions, considering those different affordances and the information you're getting at different points would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm picturing like I wonder if seeing information that's been like labeled false by the community multiple times or being repeatedly exposed to it would still end up being more like believable or like perceived to be true than information you only see once that is like more accurate seeming and not labeled false.
Yeah. So that would be work that comes out of the truth effect literature. And typically the findings is that or that corrections generally decrease belief in that content. And so there is some work on potential backfire effects, but by and large, seeing corrections and seeing flags generally is effective at reducing belief. I have done some work where I've looked at the effects of fact checks. So you see a fact check, and then later you judge either your belief in that information or you judge your perceptions of other people's beliefs. The idea being that like just the presence of a fact check might imply that other people believe that information. And so why would information need a fact check if people didn't believe it? That's a bit of a different context than the community notes. But what we found was that seeing information corrected, it reduced your own belief in it, but we didn't find that it had an effect on your perceptions of others' beliefs. And so there's this interesting dynamic where it's correcting your own beliefs, but it's not changing your perceptions of others. But we found that when you confirm true information, so is this statement true? Yes, it's true. We found that that increased your own belief and it also increased your belief of what other people believe. And so there was this asymmetry where confirming true information increased your estimates of consensus in it while correcting false information didn't have a change on consensus estimates. And I have suspicions of why that asymmetry might occur, but I think that's also something that's really interesting, or what are the effects of corrections on your own beliefs versus consensus estimates, because the correction itself might communicate information regarding whether or not other people believe that information. So something else we've been thinking about as well for future directions.
Thanks. Yeah, this is really interesting. I'm like not super familiar with the literature, so it was fun to hear about.
I had a question. So, do you think if like you added like the consensus with like political, it would have a similar effect? Like if the content you're showing them is political and it's like against, suppose it's like a Democratic statement and they're Republican, it would still have a similar effect, or will the effects diminish a little?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And we've been trying to figure out how to go about a study like this and what type of content would be good content to use, like what type of stimuli, because a lot of the political content too there's opinions and there's also more fact-based ones and people use headlines. But yes, that's something that we've been wondering and our thought on comparing also, if it's more extreme content or less extreme content, uh, I think I'm saying I'm not sure how Ronak and I have different discussions on these, but think that there would be an effect on if you're seeing, well, I think it depends. So we've been teasing apart those different combinations of what types of consensus estimates, what type of content you're judging. So we don't know. We are also wondering.
We have I think, pre-registered our hypotheses somewhere, and at the next conference, we're gonna get a beer once you're in the study, depending on who wins. I think my prediction is that just across the board, if you see stuff, regardless of like the content, it'll just make you think that everything, like people believe it in general, but that there might be like a slight advantage if it's something that's like really extreme for like the out party, you might like presume it's more prevalent, and that you might be less calibrated because you're not like in contact and like aware of like their standards of belief. But I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I'm particularly interested in the effects of seeing extreme content that is from the other side repeated, because that's a place where I think that seeing that extreme content repeated wouldn't change your own beliefs, but it would could have an effect on your perception of what the other side believes. And so a lot of with the truth effect studies, they just look at truth as the outcome, and by and large, a lot of misinformation intervention studies look at primarily at truth, but thinking about there also being effects of exposure to content and effects of misinformation interventions that go beyond truth. And so if you're seeing extreme content repeated, even if it doesn't change your own beliefs, if it makes you think that the other side has more extreme beliefs, it makes you feel less favorable about the other side, it could have these implications for perceived polarization that we're not capturing if we're only looking at individual beliefs. So that is also a study we'd like to do.
Yeah, I love the idea of going in the direction of looking at extremes. Obviously, you said I work with Claire, it's something I think about a lot. The way that social media is an information diet of extremes that I think they misrepresent consensus. And you see them not only do more extreme people post, but the more extreme people post a lot more. And
Yeah.
so post 5 times a day, whereas people who are more moderate or neutral or nuanced post far less. And
Yeah.
so I always thought that might be feeding into like these inaccurate meta perceptions that people have about other political parties. So the average Democrat thinks the average Republican hates them way more than they do. And the average Republican thinks the average Democrat hates them way more than they do. But also the average Democrat thinks most Democrats hate Republicans more than they do. And the average Republican thinks Republicans hate Democrats way more than they do. So everybody's perceptions are wrong, not only of their outgroup, but also of their ingroup. They think their ingroup is way more extreme than they actually are if you do private measures.
Yeah.
Like Nina Chikara always reminds me, it's not just misperceptions of the outgroup, it's you have misperceptions of the ingroup too, because the only ones posting and posting a lot. So this could be like a really cool psychological process by which those emerge. So I think if you could like connect this to those meta perceptions, then you can help explain that kind of growing literature, because that literature also tests interventions that if you correct those meta perceptions, people become far less affectively polarized or prejudiced against outgroups. So then you could scaffold up that whole literature, and in some ways you could explain that whole literature. Like you've got a cool, really elegant framework for understanding that. That's my speculation anyways, but that's like how.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that that's along the lines of what we've been thinking, is that these effects are here, and you're showing, like in your work, like you see this like overrepresentation, and you see like the misperceptions that you're talking about, but it's this, I think that this as a causal, like demonstrating a causal route of that through this would be a easy connection to make, or maybe not easy, but I think like an important connection to make. The other piece of this, and this is work that's been done but not experimentally, is looking at how people make estimates of what the other side is familiar with. And so this is work from BD and BD, where they ask people about how familiar the other side is with news stories from their own news sources. And people overestimate how familiar the other side is with news stories that come from their news sources. And so people misperceive that you have more of the same knowledge, that people misperceive that the other side has more of the same knowledge. And when you think that the other side has the same knowledge as you, but they have the attitudes that they have despite that knowledge, you think more negatively of them. How could these people have these attitudes and beliefs when, how could they see all this scientific information but have these attitudes and beliefs they have, when actually they're not seeing that like same scientific information? And so thinking about this operating both through perceptions of beliefs, but also perceptions of how widely shared your knowledge is, and also this like you also don't have access to the knowledge the other side has, or the information the other side is viewing. And so thinking of this occurring both through attitudes, but also through misperceptions of or through these differences in starting knowledge and misperceptions of starting knowledge have been discussions that we've been having.
Yeah, but there's lots of cool implications of it too. Like, one would be that if you perceive consensus, you might think that that's normative. And then you might be more likely to say something about it, even if you don't agree with that. Like, that's like Billy Brady's work about moral outrage. People express more moral outrage than they feel because they think the norm is that everybody's outraged.
Mm.
And then when you say it, then you express outrage, and it makes everybody else think that there's more outrage than there is.
Yeah.
And so people they misperceive the consensus, and then they express something that they think is in line with the consensus, and that further creates a false consensus for everybody else.
Wait, that actually kind of so in Claire's work, when you have people who have these more extreme views that share it, has she done anything looking at whether the people who share are most likely to share information also think that it's normative or not?
No, but that's what I mean, like
if
that's a missing piece of the
the
puzzle,
back.
and your data makes me think that that's part of the missing piece.
Yeah, it's this like perception of.
Like I keep thinking, this data helps me think of how you could put 4 literatures together.
Yeah.
You need about 4 or 5 more studies.
Right.
And then you could kind of knit together all these literatures to provide a framework for misperceptions of consensus, then that leads to actions that maybe even misrepresent your view, then other people then further misperceive the consensus. It like creates this cycle of like the information ecosystem, just from a psychological perspective. And then you further have algorithms that give you more of what you look at. And then then that can further lead to misperceived consensus. Like, there was some story trending I went on X's, right? And I looked at one thing and it started feeding me more and more about that story, because I thought I was interested in that story. And then I'm like, oh wow, everybody's like talking about this. But it's probably just a tiny sliver of people, but the algorithm over me watching one story.
This concerns me, is like, because if I'm on TikTok, I'm seeing this content. I have no sense of what content I'm seeing because it's tuned to me, and what content other people are seeing. And so I have a friend and I'm constantly checking with her. I'm like, are you getting this on your TikTok, or is this just me? And I think this occurs at a lot of different levels, where we're now like really out of touch of what content is shared knowledge and what content we're seeing specifically targeted at us. And that like is I think another like that personalized algorithm, I think is makes this whole problem a lot more tricky, because we just now have no sense. But the degree to which people understand that other people don't have shared knowledge is not clear to me. My guess would be that most people are overestimating the extent to which other people are seeing similar content to them. But it's varying across different sites. And I think that all of that really skewing the way in which we construct our knowledge of or our sense of what is normative is, yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I think we should do, oh, sorry, Hannah's a question.
I can.
No, go, you use your question, then I'll weigh in.
I guess I was just kind of like thinking about, so like they either came from the parent forum or the like medical forum, right? And they like just saw it like, I guess when I'm thinking about like IRL, you have like you might see it on like this account on this day and this like other like TikTok on this day and this other thing, and like even if like not all repetitions are created equal in terms of like, I feel like if you maybe have like more variety, I'd be curious to see like how like a variety of sources or like feeling like they were more disconnected might like play into this like.
Yeah, totally.
And I was also where you got the 3 to 5 day delay, if there was like a particular reason for it, or if it was just like a starting point of like time of delay.
Yeah, on your first question, yeah, I think that moving to different types of exposures and different sources is a good direction. And generally the finding with this is that people oftentimes are attuned somewhat to sources. And so seeing things from a variety of sources, especially when they're more saliently different, people that might have a bigger increase on consensus estimates, although it tends to be that people are not good at fully accounting for independence of sources. Like, are you seeing a bunch of sources cite the same original source, or are you seeing it repeatedly? So my suspicion would be that people would like more variety and seeing them from better sources would have a bigger impact on scientific consensus, but even seeing it from the same sources repeatedly. But yeah, I think that looking at the boundaries of those conditions and the ways in which different exposure increase consensus is, yes, that's a very good question. The 3 to 5 day delay was fairly arbitrary. We just wanted to see if it lasted over a few days compared to we had just done it for a few minute delay in the original study, and 3 to 5 day delay is something that's fairly typical in that literature. So that was that choice.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I'll say, so another thing I was gonna say, I'm giving a talk in Washington DC next month about, and writing an article for their newsletter from National Academy of Sciences on the working title, it is Policymakers should ignore social media. And it's basically that social media is a misrepresentation and what really misrepresents what policy members think is what most people want or believe, because you're just hearing from the extremes. And I'll have to cite your paper because it's so relevant to this, but it made me think, wouldn't it be fantastic if you could run a version of this study with policymakers? And then they misrepresent what like citizens want, you know? Because if they're also misaligned, I think that's such a really powerful data point, because those are the people, lawmakers, policymakers, politicians. If they're getting they're putting their fingers to the wind of public opinion in places like social media's example I'm using here, where they're just seeing this repetition and then they're from a small sliver of people and misinferring consensus, then they're going to make policies that are more extreme than what they want. And in fact, there's more and more evidence that this is what policymakers have been doing, especially the evidence suggests Republican policymakers have gone, they're way misaligned with what the average Republican voter believes. And I think it's because they're getting information from the far right online and maybe from their primary voters who are not a representative sample of their citizens, but also same with Democrats. And so if you can show this with policymakers, it could also help explain that trend towards more and more extreme policymaking.
Like, I wonder if you could do almost like a regression discontinuity where you look at like voting records of congressional staff or like congressional people and like see if that correlates with whether they like run their own Twitter account and like something like you could like
Oh,
you know?
yeah. How online are you? it was a shock to me coming to the center that I'm currently working at, where I hadn't really been on Twitter much. And the center, when I joined, like everyone was on Twitter, and all the research was so focused on Twitter and discussion around all these things on Twitter. And I had to be like, I don't know almost no one else in my everyday life that is on Twitter. And so like the idea of how important Twitter was and how everyone was getting all this information was on Twitter. I was like, no one else is seeing all the stuff that you're seeing. And I think too, as researchers, we see like a lot of, we are also like in our own specific information environments and are not attuned to what the general population is using to get information.
And I would just say that that particularly is a problem for policymakers, because their job is to design policy that appeals, that people want, that meets their needs and requests. And so
Yeah.
that's, for us, as scientists, who cares if we're supposed to just study theoretical questions we want or whatever. We're not bound to the public opinion, but they are.
Yeah.
So this will end up
Yeah.
like social media and like the
Yeah.
basic tenets of like.
Yeah, they're the
democracy.
main group in society that's supposed to care about that.
Yeah.
Ani has a question.
Yeah, I guess like more thinking about what else the downstream consequences are. So we have a bunch of data looking at the sense for uniqueness or the desire for uniqueness and belief in conspiracy theories. So I was thinking, I wonder whether someone takes that as a cue that something is off. The more people they say, it's like, oh, like there must be I don't know, the Rothschilds might plant that information because so many people think about it. Or they think that's a consensus, so I have to believe something completely different to stick out. So I was just curious whether there's any data on that or.
Yeah, so this idea that some people might use that estimates of that familiarity or perceptions of consensus actually as a cue that something is wrong and that it's not true. Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of that work that speaks directly to that. And I think that's an interesting question. In the metacognitive, and from the metacognitive perception, people have these feelings of familiarity, but then you're applying your lay theories to what that familiarity means. So it's familiar, so it must be that lots of people believe it. But you can play with what lay theories people have, and people might have different lay theories of like, oh, um, like I've heard it, it sounds really familiar, but it's familiar because Trump said it a lot. So actually it's like not true. And so, yes, I think that there's the potential for these effects and the way in which repetition affects your judgments to vary depending on what meaning you're placing on the familiarity. And I think potentially if you have someone that thinks something is something feels, I've seen it lots of times, it feels familiar, so lots of people must believe it. And in this case, lots of people believing it is actually a cue that something's off. I could definitely see that being a potential pathway. Although my guess is you'd have to get a very specific situation to play out to find that. But yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
And, Maddy, are you looking for a new postdoc position, by the way, to complete these 4 missing studies and then unite?
I'm looking for a job. Yeah.
Just curious.
Yeah.
Sorry,
It was need for uniqueness, you said?
Yeah, we have, it's need for uniqueness, but then it gets very complicated because it's also need for shared reality. So when you're scoring on both, it's actually the most likely that you believe conspiracy theories. So yeah,
because Pennycook also has that work that's around like people overestimating how many agree with the conspiracy theories, which is it's like there's like something like to reconcile with like the role of consensus and conspiracy belief, because obviously you want other people, like you're not believing things that literally you're the only person that believes them, but what's the kind of, yeah, I think that's an interesting area with consensus that I don't know enough to speak to intelligently, but I think that's really interesting, is the role of consensus and conspiracy beliefs, and is it different than the way people typically use consensus as a cue?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Maddy.